Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. It's wonderful to see an audience at this time of the morning, and everyone looks very awake, and I can guarantee you that this will be stimulating and invigorating and wake you up even more. I'm Leslie Powell. I'm the Dean of the College of Public Policy at Hamad bin Khalifa University here in Doha. I'll introduce our distinguished speakers in a moment, but as you know, the panel topic is on resilience, governance, and public policy for the 21st century. We're here addressing problems through these 2 days at the Doha Forum, but of course we're also trying to address solutions. And the way in which those solutions are addressed is obviously through governments, and governments that have capacity can respond to those problems more effectively. Governments that lack capacity will respond less effectively. One of the elements of capacity is resilience. It's something that's been percolating in the academic literature, in the scholarly literature, in the public administration and management and policy literature for some time, and also among practitioners. It can be thought of as a relatively abstract concept, but to try to give it some edges, we can think of resilience as embracing the capacity to systematically marshal policy evidence, the characteristic of flexible organizations, of policy leadership that can adapt to new circumstances and turbulence, which we heard about yesterday, of coping calmly with crisis and recovering from crises, and combining all of that with innovation, stability, and purpose. We have 4 distinguished speakers who will help us concretize, it's a terrible word, I apologize, but make more concrete or specific what we mean by this somewhat abstract concept. So our first, and I'll introduce them briefly, and then I'm going to pose a question to each of them in sequence, and then we may have a second round of some discussion, and then of course we'll open it up for audience participation. On my immediate left is Mr. Achim Steiner, the UNDP administrator since June of 2017. He's also the vice chair of the UN Sustainable Development Group, which unites 40 entities of the UN system that work to sustainable development. To his left is Dr. Zeger van der Wal from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. He is also assistant dean there and the co-curator of the World Economic Forum's The Future of Governance Initiative. To his left is Dr. Andreas Reckkemer, who's a senior professor, a colleague of mine at the College of Public Policy at Hamad bin Khalifa University, and he also has held senior positions with the United Nations, including that of Executive Director of the International Human Dimensions Program on Global Environmental Change at the United Nations University. And to his left is Ms. Pia Hansson, who is the Director of the Institute of International Affairs and its 3 centers, the Center for Small State Studies, the Center for Arctic Studies, and the Reykjavik Peace Center. So, my first question will be to Mr. Achim. The capacity to respond with agility is at the heart of resilience planning. However, agility is not often associated with bureaucracy-heavy international organizations. Based on your very extensive experience, how can international organizations both become more resilient and support governments in that effort?
Thank you, Leslie, and good morning, everybody. Is the microphone on? Yes. Thank you for what is in some ways a loaded question. So I am a representative of a heavy public organization that by implication is neither agile nor able to exercise a great deal of foresight, especially in the 21st century when black swans emerge, as the program says, so rapidly. So I take this question very much in the spirit of, how do we manage to respond better as public institutions embedded in a governance system that either allows political leadership, whether it is parliaments, whether it is heads of state or heads of government, but also the institutions that essentially allow society to recognize what is happening within it and around it. And here I think we, in some respects, overemphasize the black swan nature of events, because I think very often things are not as unpredictable as they're made out to be. And secondly, I think public institutions can indeed respond with agility, and it is not so much in the nature of being a public institution, but rather of how a public institution is responsive and is also accountable. So I don't want to begin by talking about the UN or the United Nations Development Programme, and indeed, UNDP is a large organization. It works in 170 countries. It has 17,000 staff members. So how do you manage such an institution with agility and responsiveness? Let me take a step back, in part, by first of all focusing it on what it is there to do, which is to help countries, societies, governments to recognize where the challenges for their development lies, how governance, in terms of resilient institutions, functional public services, can function, but also to recognize what is happening within the country. I speak to you today on the back of about 5 days of global conversations that we have had as UNDP in launching the 2019 Human Development Report. Its theme this year is on inequalities. Now, to those who say, well, much of what we see on the evening news around the world, be it in Hong Kong or in Beirut or in Paris or in Santiago de Chile or in a number of Latin American countries right now, is surprising. Why would people be frustrated in Chile, the country with the extraordinary GDP growth story, et cetera, et cetera? Well, 3 years ago, UNDP published a report largely with leaders in society, in academia in Chile, called The Unequals. And it actually became a mirror with which Chile was looking at its own track record, namely that it has become the country with the greatest income inequality in the world, that it is a country that when you adjust it in its ranking in the Human Development Index that UNDP's report puts forward, it goes from a GDP position 14 slots down if you adjust it for inequality. Now, some people would argue, these riots were surprising, and why on the back of an increase of a public transport fare? Well, because people did not want to see what was actually there to be seen, namely that a society that does not pick up on the fact that inequality can only go up to a point, and then people start responding, reacting, rebelling, they become more polarized. I mean, all of that which we see around the world right now points to the fact that it is a political class, it is also a political economy rather than the institution, government, or public service that is lacking agility. So I think one of the lessons we are learning right now is that we need to make essentially public institutions more capable of having a political class of leaders be accountable, because if not, then the truth that you want to communicate becomes the truth that is communicated. And that is often the misleading part when we talk about black swans in public policy. Now, obviously, you can't predict an earthquake, you can't predict, a extreme weather event, but you could have predicted a lot of what we are seeing unfold in the financial crisis, the Arab Spring, or indeed right now, what seems to be a sort of thread running across the world, that more and more people are buying out of a paradigm that said, look, it is the economics of globalization that dictates how our societies must adjust. And that is precisely what people are saying there are limits to that. And I think our public institutions, including, and here I want to not run away from the challenge of a UN organization, I lead an organization right now that actually is in the midst of reinventing its own purpose in looking at the future of development. And agility is not something that escapes us as a driver for evolving. Thank you.
Thank you. So you've put your finger on the issue of foresight and being able to monitor and assess the environment and respond to it and be accountable to it. So we'll come back to that. Thank you very much. Dr. Zegger, what kind of skills do public managers need in the 21st century to support resilient or agile policymaking? And this may connect to the points that Mr. Hakim just made.
Surely. Thanks, Leslie, and good morning to you all. No, I do indeed think that when we talk about resilience, there's an institutional side to resilience. So how can we, create organizations and bureaucracies that are resilient, adaptive, agile, evidence-based, and so on? There's even perhaps a national side to the issue. When we think about small states, small, agile, nimble states like Iceland, Singapore, Qatar, and others. But I think there's also an individual side to resilience. And that is all about, how can we make sure the public sector leaders that lead our institutions have the proper skills and competencies to kind of effectively lead them into the future. So in much of my own recent work, I've been looking at, what these types of skills actually constitute. So what kind of competencies do public sector leaders need to master to be effective in the 21st century. I think to an extent, some of these skills are, I guess, mindsets or attitudes rather than skills that one could pick up, at a workshop or during a master's program. They have to be, to some extent, already be a part of someone's DNA, and probably have to be learned on the job, to an extent. If we talk about resilience, I think resilience is probably forged and mastered during times of crisis, and not always easy to kind of prepare for, let's say, in a classroom or in a training program. There's a couple of related skills that may be interesting to just mention here. I think one of them is the importance of strategic foresight and evidence-based policy making. And in my classrooms nowadays, I always assume that most of my students are actually much smarter than I am, and I always tell them, you have the opportunity to get information. You have information at your fingertips, any type of information, any type of day. But I think if there's one skill, we could teach you at academic institutions, is actually the ability to filter and prioritize information and to distinguish, authoritative, high-quality evidence and data from essentially your average Facebook post and everything in between. And I think increasingly that's actually probably one of the most important skills for public sector leaders, to be able to get the right information, the right facts quickly, and then act upon them and make decisions based on high quality information. I think a second one I'd like to mention is the ability to master what I call in my work stakeholder multiplicity. So to be able to deal with many different types of stakeholders, each on their own platform, using their own type of language. If you talk about all these recent protests, for instance, and the yellow jackets in France, les gilets jaunes, who are now a phenomenon in over 22 countries, these are very different types of stakeholders to deal with for public sector leaders than, let's say, your highly educated, policy-interested stakeholders that attend your consultation exercises and your public hearings and are actually genuinely interested to participate in interactive policy making. So I think the ability to speak to, engage, activate, convince, seduce, if you will, very, very different type of stakeholders is also a very, very important skill for public sector leaders today.
Wonderful, thank you. And Dr. Andreas, the question that I would like to pose to you is the meaning of resilience, specifically in terms of either the Sustainable Development Goals or in the context of environmental policy and climate change. So we're going from general international or organizational skills and requirements. Dr. Zegger highlighted some individual mindsets or skills. Now I'm asking you, Dr. Andreas, to help us understand how resilience might be expressed in a specific set of policy fields.
Thank you. Conceptually, resilience thinking really has come a long way in the recent past, and it has evolved to be multidimensional and very interdisciplinary, from very simple bounce-back ideas via recovery models to adaptation and more recently transformation. And I want to speak a little bit about the transformative aspect of resilience and, if you will, an all-society approach which complements organizational, institutional, structural learning and agency. What it means to be resilient, of course, depends very much on the problem or situations we are faced with. And as we all know very well, public policy, whether at the national level, regionally, or globally, is more and more faced with not necessarily a lot of black swans, but definitely a lot of complexity and uncertainty. We all know that very well. So that scenario really requires an approach that is multi-level, multi-sector, multi-actor, and very integrated. And if we look at the SDGs, of course, that mirrors the complexity we are talking about, because it's not only about 17 goals and 169 targets and et cetera, but it's really the very intricate set of issues and grand challenges and policy problems that are basically at the interface of all of these, or most of these goals. So we're talking about complexity and the feedback loops, as we call it, that exist across systems. So that is being called social ecological systems. A lot of the problems identified in the SDGs are both environmental problems and, of course, social problems as well. And they become societal issues, and that's why transformative approaches are necessary. So the example of global environmental change, which includes climate change, is not limited to it. Drought, land degradation, biodiversity loss, eroding ecosystem services, etc., more and more directly affect society at a level where it becomes a critical question of functioning of states. We're talking about overall fragility. We're talking about failed statehood, conflict, even violent conflict, and forced migration. So there we can really see how the issues play out, these grand challenges. They are deeply intertwined, interconnected, and always create these feedback loops back and forth, making things only worse. Now, clearly, there is no bounce back option. Some of the engineering solutions are still looking at that, and that's fine, but for an all-of-society approach, there's no bounce back, and very often we can't even really fully recover. We have to be realistic. So resorting to adaptive capacity is important, but I want to really make the case for an all-of-society approach to transformative capacity that would basically lead the agenda towards resilience. And we have to transform our energy sectors. We have to transform our mobility and transportation sectors, the way we look at urbanization and urban planning, our education sectors for sure, labor sector. We have to quite radically change the economic incentive system we are in. So these are grand transformations in the face of these grand challenges, and the ability of our societies to engage in this huge collective social learning process towards these transformations will direct or will really define the level of resilience that we are looking at. And of course, this is while we have to adapt to the effects of global warming, sea level rise, forced migration, etc., etc. One last remark, because we also wanted to talk a little bit about governance, I believe, and I really see this resilience and governance as of course, two important, a pair of two important paradigms. And the way I see it is that resilience is really the goal in the overarching paradigm, and governance is the vehicle to get us there. But we have to rethink governance for the 21st century, for sure.
Thank you, Dr. Andreas. Now, speaking of governance, I'll pose a question to Ms. Pia. In respect to smaller states and how they respond to crises and challenges, are smaller states like Qatar and Iceland by default more capable or less capable of agile resistance planning than their counterparts? And are there any lessons that larger states can learn from small states' resilience planning activities and strategies?
Thank you very much. And thank you actually for inviting me to be part of this panel, which I enjoy very much. Also being the only female representative, that's always good. Yeah. Thought I'd just get that in there. Yes, from a small state perspective, when we're looking at resilience, of course, what we're talking about with small states, the first thing I usually get asked is, what do you mean? What's the definition? There are all kinds of definitions for small states. So it kind of depends on how we want to take it. But I think that it's certainly not enough to not just talk about population size, because then you really get into trouble quite fast. There are other factors, of course, that contribute to how you can define a state. And hello? Yeah, okay. In some instances, we can also talk about the capabilities and can you influence? Do you have that kind of a power? That often is a good way of trying to define whether a state is small or not. So just to get that kind of out of the way, I think that most of us would then agree that Iceland is a small state, right? We have a population of 350,000 people. I'd also like to throw in the mix that we don't have a military. That usually gets people quite upset when they hear that. So from a pragmatic point of view, and that's the point of view that I think that small states tend to need to use. Iceland then, of course, is part of NATO, for example, which provides shelter. So this is the characteristic of small states. You need to be very pragmatic, right? You need to be able to play to your strong sides. You need to find your niche and use the capabilities you have to make those stronger. This is also a matter of flexibility, of course. You know, where are you going to put your efforts? And prioritizing then becomes the main thing. Pulling up whatever it is that makes you possibly have some sort of an influence in some area is going to be the way to go for small states. And that's kind of where you see the successful small states leaning. It certainly helps to have a lot of natural resources. So without being any kind of specialist, this is my first time in Qatar, I can really not say anything further about that. But that has certainly been a strength for Iceland, to be able to tap into what kind of things it is that we have that maybe goes beyond what someone else can offer. And there I'd like to throw in as well that Iceland has strategic importance. And that is something that we've been able to maybe capitalize on, in a sense. Where we are located in the world makes sense in that regard. That we're actually in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean has provided us with the possibility of actually, maybe I'd say at some point, playing to both sides. Historically speaking, that has happened. But always with the mindset of being pragmatic, because you have what you have and you need to maximize that as much as you can. So all these aspects, of course, play into when a crisis occurs. So, for example, when the economic crisis of 2008 hit, it hit Iceland very hard. But at the same time, the possibility of actually responding quite fast to that helped Iceland out of it. So I think that there is this resilience built in a sense, when you have a well-functioning society. And I think it matters. There are a few other factors that matter there, of course, as well. That you have actually a good governance system, that you have a society that is used to these kinds of crises, whether they are natural disaster crises or something else, that you actually have to pull together. And I think that's where size comes in and actually helps out, in a sense, because you feel that maybe togetherness. And I'd even go as far as saying that there are some instances where the size becomes a strength. And that's, for example, when you look at issues of the Nordic countries being able to step in and assist in peace-building efforts or in negotiations. And I think the size factor matters there because the other actors will tend to look at the small states and say, that's no threat. So that's one thing, but also then being able to bring to the table a trustworthy relationship, you know, actually having that kind of an identity that people will trust, whatever it is that's being put on the table from the Nordic countries. So this is also very important in the whole aspect of how are you going to succeed as a small state and building that identity and trying to strengthen that is, of course, what matters the most.
Thank you very much. I mean, in terms of the Icelandic response to the financial crisis, I was struck yesterday by a couple of comments from ministers from Qatar talking about the impact of the blockade. And for example, in terms of products, the impact on air travel and the airport, and how the blockade is now something considered in the past. That was a quote from one of His Excellencies. And Qatar was able to respond and adapt with relative agility to these circumstances. So those are two instances of fairly rapid, flexible, adaptable response. And again, the interesting thing is, like, what are the ingredients? What is the X factors that are involved in that capability? And being small, having some levels of trust, foresight, adaptability in terms of information flows within government, so that the system can respond brittle. It can adapt to the circumstances. So I'm going to just pose one more quick question to our panelists, and not in any particular order, if anybody has a thought. If you were to think about, and you've all touched on issues of foresight, of multi-level governance, of flexibility, of evidence, but if you were to make recommendations to governments, to leaders of governments or institutional leaders, what would be one recommendation you might make in terms of actualizing or implementing any one of the characteristics that we've identified as qualifying for resilient government? Is there some concrete institutional change or ingredient that you would recommend or see as most important in how a government could inject resilience into its institutional structures? And I'll just open it up for anyone to jump in, and then we'll have some audience participation. Second?
If I may, Les, thanks. I think just two quick points. First of all, I don't think any self-respecting public sector institution these days thinks that they can go it alone. I think cross-sectoral collaboration may very well be the vehicle for 21st century governance. So I think in addressing many of the wicked problems governments face, they have to be able to collaborate effectively with private sector institutions, with non-profits, with kind of community initiatives, and actually that's easier said than done. They have to step back from a command and control, we are the government type of mindset and type of management style, and become much more of a sort of facilitator and empowerer of others, and an incentivizer of other sectors that they actually need to flourish in order to do well themselves. And I think a second issue worth mentioning here is investing in talent. So what I over the world is that public sector organizations are actually having attracting and recruiting highly capable individuals and talented graduates, because they have so many organizations and so many options to choose from, right? So I think for any public sector organization to be able to, let's say, attract talented data analysts who may otherwise go and work for Google or Facebook is actually a really pressing issue. So I think governments have a lot going for them in terms of their value proposition. I mean, they can offer the most intellectually challenging, stimulating, kind of public interest-oriented type of work any sector possibly can. But they have to, I think, do a bit of a better job in many cases in promoting the public sector as an exciting place to work in order to sort of draw in these talented individuals.
Mr. Hakim?
I was, in one sense, following Zega's comment just now about the challenge of attracting people, and I agree with you. And at the same time, I also would argue, but public institutions are perfectly capable of doing so if they present themselves in the marketplace as what they are, which is a purpose-led organization. We talk a lot in management schools and business schools and the big companies around the world about the importance of purpose today. And we had a shared management retreat about a year and a half ago with some of the leadership in EY that went itself, Ernst & Young formerly, through a process of identifying what is its purpose, and this is a company that is in some ways as global as the United Nations. And I think we learned a lot from each other, because one of the things, and here let me refer to the organization, the idea that I work for, which is the United Nations. And actually, despite a lot of the cynicism, skepticism that often prevails, I don't think, have a problem attracting extraordinary people because the idea is so powerful, first of all. Now, the question is, can an institution also live up to, that sense of agility? And here, just to, acknowledge also Pia's point, take something like gender equity in an organization. It has haunted us for years, for decades. Actually, I have to say, I have only been at UNDP, and I do not attribute this to my own, unique skills, but I have built on the work of others, less than 2 years to achieve gender equity across the senior leadership level, the next tier, and the next tier down. UNDP today is an organization led 50-50 by men and women. It's not impossible, but you have to believe in the value of investing in it and then actually also do it. The same thing is agility. In fact, with the Qatar Foundation in Germany, we launched in just 12 months 60 accelerator labs across the world. People always said, oh, you can't do that in a UN institution, it's far too slow. Absolute rubbish. If you recognize the importance of agility, of innovation, of rethinking your development model, a heavy institution, in inverted commas, like the UN is capable of doing that. But here comes the point. I think as I said, is there one thing that stands out? And perhaps my slightly distinct contribution is to look at multilateralism and ask myself the question, well, is multilateralism on the retreat? And I think it's actually the opposite. Now, in part it is because the institutions themselves have sometimes been slow, so leaders such as myself have to take responsibility for renewal and refocusing. But secondly, we also have to remind those who make up the United Nations of the unique value proposition of having a multilateral system, of having a rules-based and normative platform on which small and large states can interact with each other. And if you ever want to see the symbolism of the United Nations, because you referred repeatedly to small states, please one day take a look and ponder on the fact that when the United Nations was founded, we created a hall in which every member state has a seat. It can be 350,000 people, it can be 1.4 billion people. You have a seat, you have a vote, you have a voice. And in our world of today, I think we have, in the politics of the day, begun to neglect what a unique creation that was at the time, and it is part of the resilience of a post-Second World War international order. Now, what we're doing to it right now is another debate. But I just want to leave you with that thought, because if you talk about resilience, it's not just the David versus Goliath strength. I mean, obviously, there are small countries that are extraordinary. Singapore, Iceland, I mean, we could name many of them. But look also at the small island states right now. Total victims of a 20th century economy in the 21st century. No capacity to defend themselves, and having to watch, as we're doing right now as we sit here in Doha, a climate conference in Madrid, where the power of the rich, the big polluters, the emitters, if not checked by an international system, can literally determine whether a nation exists in 50 years' time. This is multilateralism at work in the 21st century. Thank you.
Can I
Pia?
just add a few words to that? Because I totally agree with you. I think it's got everything to do with purpose. And when we look towards the young generation today, we need to realize that the job seekers of the young generation, they're going to be looking at things like, does this matter? Is this actually something that I want to work for? Is this something that I want to do? And I think that these issues really have to come to the forefront, because it's a changed world. It really is changing, and it's changing quite fast. And looking towards what the young generation is thinking about today, with the protests that are going on and the climate change issues and their fight for that, it's really interesting to look at. But they're not going to be picking the same kinds of jobs as we did. You know, they're going to be looking at the companies where they're possibly thinking about getting employment, and they want to know, are they socially responsible? Are they doing things the way that I want them to be done? At least I think this is where we're going. I hope so.
Dr. Anders?
Yeah, coming back to the question, what can we tell government, so to speak, to be a little bit more agile in looking at these challenges going forward? Definitely start taking scientific evidence seriously, especially when it's overwhelming. When it is based on the most thorough peer-reviewed scientific assessments ever in history, such as done in the IPCC. Take this seriously, stop the cynical approaches. Secondly, to follow up on Zeger's point about network governance, or however we would like to call it, build fluid institutional settings that can respond fast and in a multi-sectoral fashion. And the UN has done it as well with UN Land, UN Energy, Arena. This is a new model for network governance, decentralized, and it can also be done and mirrored actually by national governments, which means that there has to be an integration of sectors across ministries, and that requires some creative thinking in reorganizing bureaucracies, reorganizing structure. So institutional reform that's also purpose-led, that's goal-oriented, and that tries to capture the complexity of the challenges public administration is set up for. And then also rethink the relationship between structure and agency, meaning don't allocate all the power to the institutions, but really capitalize on all the bright talents in the country. This is an investment into education, into problem-based learning, new skills, problem-solving skills. And Qatar Foundation that we are employees of, Les and I, has really done a remarkable job on that education front, because we need this social learning. We need this all-of-society approach that I have talked about before.
We'll open it up to audience questions in a moment, but if I may add a couple of points to my own question, and just building on the remarks that our colleagues have made. If you think about resilience in governance, it's some kind of ability to respond, react with agility, innovation, foresight, and then return to some kind of steady state. So, you know, at a personal, individual level, we think of people as being resilient if they can address crisis and then return calmly to some sort of steady state. In other words, they don't get distracted. They're capable of responding. How do you embed that into institutions? Let me quickly make a couple of points. And first, in terms of our own institutions and training of students, one of the things that we're trying to do in our Masters of Public Policy program, and this is characteristic of others like Zegers at LKY, is an emphasis on pragmatism and experience. Try as much as possible to give students coming through programs in governance and public policy and administration a range of experiences in different policy fields and hands-on experience, so that it's not all theory. They actually learn something about how things are done in the real world, and they build their capacities. In terms of leaders like yourselves in public organizations, I would recommend two things. One, mentorship. If you're working with young people, if you're trying to bring your human talent, your human capacities along, the best way they can learn is from people that have already had those experiences. In other words, resilience is a capacity to not be surprised, at least at one level. And the more that you can bring new people in organizations into that kind of mindset where they aren't completely surprised and by circumstances. So one way of doing that is through mentorship. Another one is through stretch assignments, to test and challenge your employees. Don't keep them in the same box all the time, doing the same routine things. Give them mentorship and give them challenges in a controlled way, and responsibilities, and in a variety of different fields, even when they're young and junior. And the payoffs are remarkable in terms of their ability to calmly address new situations and circumstances. So that's my 2 cents worth. I couldn't resist. Our first question is from the gentleman there with the pink tie.
Thank you very much. Oh, I need to stand up.
And please identify yourself and direct your question to.
Okay, my name is Haroon Sharif. I was till recently a Minister of Investment in Pakistan. So my question is actually aimed towards the UNDP head here, administrator, and others if they want to comment. I think the resilience, as it's been articulated, obviously has come from investment in people and evidence, and be quick to respond. So what I saw in my, what happens is that 75% of the time of a complex, large country's cabinet, where does it go? Do we talk about the internal or external shocks? Do we talk about foresight? Do we talk about SDGs? Unfortunately, the answer is no. What we talk about is we are reactive to all the shocks. What we talk about is what's coming on Twitter, what's coming on social media and media. What we talk about is how to maintain stability and how to actually keep your constituency intact. So that the gap between thinking of international multilateral organizations and the people who are in the arena has actually widened quite a bit. So the people who have the stake in that economy, and I'll come to my question now. So my question is that what happens is when the state becomes reactive and states become very short-term oriented, so the thinking part is, unwantedly outsourced to the UNDPs of this world and the World Banks of this world. So what happens is that you think for a state where you do not have a stake in that state. So unless and until, my question is your model of engagement, how can you actually build resilience in the state institutions and deregulate, bringing consultants from New York and somewhere? I don't think it's going to happen, so I would like to have a comment.
Thank you. We'll take one or two more questions. So the gentleman here and the gentleman there.
Good morning. My name is Jakob. I'm from Singapore. I just want to pick up Ziga's point and just open it up for some comments. I agree that in this 21st century, networking, collaboration, partnership is important, not just internally, but also externally. Internally, obviously, we talk about government in terms of the depth that you have within your own ministry, for example, that links all the way to the humble clerk at the bottom, and of course across ministries, but also going beyond the ministries into the private sector. But in so doing, you come across choices and compromises. So, and in these days, because of a lot of the big wicked problems that you mentioned, governments of the day can draw a lot of information, but finally somebody has to decide what is good for the country. And in so doing, you have trade-offs, you have compromises. How do you find that sweet spot? I know there's no answer, but I just will get some thoughts in arriving at what you think is the best, both for yourself as a country, but also for the stakeholders that you have engaged. Because obviously when you draw upon them, they expect something in return in terms of the views that they have shared. Thank you.
One last question from that gentleman there, please. And in the interest of time, if you could keep your question brief, please.
Hi, this is Nishad from Arab Youth Climate Movement Qatar. I just arrived from COP25 in Madrid. What we see is a text which is coming, which is not what everybody is looking forward for. We had a great opportunity as for a Paris Agreement, which was a global agreement which every country would abide to. What we are seeing in Madrid is sort of a failure agreement which not every people want to see, which is always questioning the future of our community, young people who is coming forward for, and their asks are not being met. How do you think a government in this century can really hear what young people are asking for? Climate marches are happening. We had that one in Friday too. We had a sit-in yesterday at the COP. What we see is governments are not reacting. The response have been very chilling. Most of the people left the venue. Very few delegates are working on the text, and the text looks really, really not good. The factors like human rights have been not included, loss and damages have been not considered. How do you think government would respond to this call for young people? Everybody talks about it. What's on reality isn't what we want to see. So how do you think governments in this century would react to what young people aspire for? Climate change is a great example.
Okay, I think we've had the question. Thank you very much. So I'll ask our panelists to respond briefly. We have about 5 minutes left to those questions as they were directed. Perhaps we'll start with Dr. Zegger since he had a specific question.
Sure. So great questions about collaboration and where's the sort of sweet spot, because ultimately governments still have to make most of the decisions. They're mandated by the people, and they have a monopoly on legislation, taxation, regulation, and so on. We cannot just outsource that to businesses or non-profit organizations. I think in this sense, Singapore is quite an interesting case because as a country, it's considered to have, I would argue a high degree of government capacity. It is the envy of many of its Western, brethren these days. But at the same time, I think it's also facing increasingly sort of the scrutiny and impatience of critical stakeholders, like any developed country, and is trying to kind of design consultation processes to get stakeholders engaged. Probably the most important component here is to be honest, in my view, to be honest towards stakeholders. What will actually happen with their input? Are they just there as a sort of rubber stamp machine to essentially approve a policy proposal that has already been formulated, 99%? Or are they there to sort of genuinely provide input, creative ideas, expertise that the government may not have in-house? I think either way, frankly, is fine. But I think it's crucial to be honest about what will happen with the input provided by non-governmental stakeholders at the end of the day. And frankly, being able to voice concerns, being able to give input in the first place is probably already half the work in terms of getting more ownership from stakeholders.
Any of our, Dr. Andrews?
Yeah, just very briefly, I'm grateful for your remarks, sir, coming from Madrid, and because I was trying to talk a little bit about the power of social movements, about scientific evidence that has to be taken more seriously, etc., the transformative capacity built in states, and we see this in real time, how important these things actually are, because a business as usual approach is getting us nowhere, and it is quite honestly outraging to see that the number one emitter just goes there basically not only to block everything but also to destroy the agreement and then also ask for investments into their own companies. What to do? It's a great question. The social movements have started, Fridays for Future, etc. Actually, it is incredible that a 16-year-old young lady is becoming the leader and the icon, actually, of this movement. But this is exactly the point. And so hopefully we will see more spaces in the public where these social movements starts, of young, educated people. Again, the problem-based learning skills in education, be it school education or higher education, is super important. So we don't have the time, but I'm afraid we have to bet a little bit in the future and a new generation that will speak truth to power more loudly.
Any other? Oh, sorry, Pia, please.
No, yeah, I just wanted to basically say the same thing. I think that social movements is really something that we should be watching now. But it's also interesting to see that in Madrid there's all these small states are trying to push as well for a change in climate in the climate issues. So it was mentioned at the beginning that, of course, in the General Assembly of the UN, we all have a vote, right? However large we are. That's very important. And I think that if there is this possibility of actually bandwagoning together, in the end, it's going to make a difference. I truly just have to be naive and believe that although the big powers are, as we see now, trying to block everything that's going on, we cannot give up. We just have to keep going at it. And I think that there are too many like-minded people in the world for this not to go the right way.
Mr. Hakim, last word.
Very briefly to our colleague from Pakistan, I could not agree with you more. I think this phenomenon that government is consumed by the daily running of essentially an economy with shocks the institutional dynamics, the inertia, the politics of parliament, legislative versus executive, and the judiciary, and in Pakistan, intense life as a politician, we're thinking about the future, about the strategy of a pathway in terms of development, often ends up being outsourced. Now, I agree with you entirely that if that becomes the modus operandi, sooner or later something will not work. And I think it is precisely why I am deeply reflecting with many of my colleagues, but also constituents, on what is the future of development and what is also the role of development institutions such as the Development Program of the United Nations, or indeed other partners, multilateral development banks, in helping a nation express through its political process a choice. Because I think the age we're living in is very much about the way we make choices in trying to figure out how do you operate in a complicated world where many things are set. And part of trying to reset UNDP's lens also is, for example, these accelerator labs, by looking at sustainable finance, looking at the emergence of the digital economy as the true sort of seismic shifts that are defining the development horizons of countries, and then assist in the challenge of dealing with complexity. I think this is part of why I'm a great fan of the Sustainable Development Goals, which people think is just a few boxes with some nice goals. No, they're the risk map of the 21st century, and the reason why they resonate seemingly so well is that they allow a public conversation in which complexity is not decreed to be too high for you as a citizen to be part of it, and then other actors. Very briefly on, that relates to, Jakub, your point about trade-offs and who decides. I think part of what we are witnessing right now across the world is a kind of reaction by citizens about the decisions that have been taken in their name, and with the rationale that we need to make trade-offs, and since you as a body politic cannot do it, we will do it as your leaders. And when we talk about globalization being one of the metaphors through which this debate is happening, it is in part because the way that leaders have been forced to decide to make trade-offs is not something that people consider acceptable. You can see that in the European Union context, and 15 years ago there was the first corrective when people in Europe said, look, Europe is not about Brussels. So the notions of complementarity, for example, were introduced, and subsidiarity, to try and retain the fact that people don't want to be only governed from the top. Fairness, dignity, these are the currencies with which people are currently judging the outcomes of so-called trade-offs that were decided for them. And I end on just a very brief remark also about Madrid and climate change. The first thing is, I often begin when I am in fora and we talk about multilateralism in the United Nations. The UN was not created because the world is united. Let's remember that. It is precisely because nations are not necessarily aligned. They have different interests, they have different histories, they have different scars, legacies, colonialism, etc. So the United Nations is never the body in which harmony and love is the starting point. It's the opposite. Once you embrace that, you understand what a unique contribution multilateralism has made to allow the world to even begin to address a challenge such as climate change. That is almost without precedent in requiring collective action, for which we are ill-prepared, because there are some countries that are doing extremely well, thank you very much, on the 20th century fossil fuel-based economy, that have much to lose if they have to switch. There are many countries that come into this game that have hardly emitted anything and are facing implosion and have no way of actually exercising control over their future. So out of Madrid, let me say the following. Madrid and what we're witnessing right now is not the end, it's not the failure of multilateralism, it is the affirmation of why we have multilateralism. Had we not created, first of all, an independent group of scientists, which the UN almost provided protective custody over 25 years ago, so that science would not be subjected to national interest. That is why we have today the IPCC being able to give the world as close an approximation to what is that which we know without being filtered through national politics. Secondly, the convention has allowed us to bring together for 25 years, every year in the limelight of public attention, every government around the world, and let the public judge what their governments are either doing or not doing. So Madrid may end in a postponement of a decision, But ultimately, let us see the progressive nature of how policymaking has worked. And this is my point. The United Nations never begins with unanimity, it never begins with a breakthrough. It is the world's capacity to articulate progressive policymaking, whether it was decolonization, whether it is human rights, whether it is governance, and I could go on. Today, a principal challenge is how do we bring the world together to act on climate change despite all the differences, interests that prevail. And I leave Madrid just as frustrated as every young person will be on the street that you refer to, Andreas. But I also say to them, on the day after Madrid, I will stand up with UNDP and stick by the climate promise we made. 100 countries we will work with over the next 12 months to help them deliver what the Paris Agreement envisaged. Enhanced, more ambitious national climate strategies. Because there may be 10 countries who currently, for reasons of their own, making and thinking, and their ability to slow things down, are actually creating problems in Madrid. But ultimately, this convention and climate action is carried by over 190 nations. And we will see that, yes, we will have setbacks, but ultimately, the world will actually prevail. And those who are not part of this compromise, be prepared, because the world will start reacting to it. Let me just mention border adjustment tariffs. Markets of the future will reward or sanction those who are part or not part of this effort to actually give the world a chance to deal with climate change. So it's difficult, it's painful, it is sometimes extremely frustrating to watch this, but this is the real world, and multilateralism cannot create a parallel universe. It is rooted in the real world with all the inequalities, but show me one other place where we could do better than there in actually addressing that inequality. So it's just a thought to keep your faith in the idea that we're actually heading in the right direction with all the setbacks that it implies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our audience. Go forward and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.